technology that brings us together. We are grateful. We are grateful for this time together to think, to ponder, to imagine what our life in Christ means for us this day. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. Well, we've come to the end of a long road. Last night I was looking through my notes on this particular adventure that started back in August, and this is how thick it is. I think it's about 50 pages of notes. So you guys have gone through a lot of material, and wow, you've made it to the end. Blessed art thou. And so today, what we're going to do is a sort of a summing up. And we're going to move sort of from biblical studies where you look at each discrete sort of text and what it meant then, et cetera, to theology, where you take together the biblical story, you take together our theological writings over the years, you take our best wisdom that we've accrued over the years, and we try to answer this question. So what does this all mean for us now? So that's the difference between doing biblical studies and doing theology. Biblical studies is largely trying to figure out what that original text was all about in its own context. And now we say, what does this all mean for us in our context? So that's our project today, and it gets a little more complicated than looking at discrete text. Okay, so the book that we're going to use today as a sort of a guide to making this sort of theological jump into the present is a classic text that almost everybody who goes to seminary ends up reading, at least in Protestant seminaries and in some Catholic seminaries as well. It's written by H. Richard Niebuhr, and it's called Christ and Culture, and it was written in 1951. A book. He was a Yale professor, and he was Reinhold Niebuhr's brother, and it grew out of reflections on the Second World War, and then the Korean conflict that was just about to really get hot, and thinking about the communist influence in the world at that time. Go back to that period of time. You remember the McCarthy era and all that? Well, he's reflecting on what a Christian's relationship to the political authorities ought to be in the year 1951. But when you look at that book, it's still quite relevant to our time in 2020. Amazingly, it has a shelf life of 70 years, and it's still useful. And one of the reasons it's useful is that it gives us broad categories for helping us understand the relationship of Christ and culture. Culture includes language and arts, et cetera, but it also includes the government. Okay. So what Reinhold, what H. Richard Niebuhr does is that he sets out 5 different ways of Christians relating to their culture. Okay. And the 2 on the opposite poles are real easy to understand. The first one would be Christ against culture. Christ that is radically opposed to some of the evils in society. Now, I'll give you a hint. The book of Revelation, chapter 13, is a kind of Christ against culture. You know, that demonic beast, those 2 beasts and the dragon and all that stuff, that's Christ against culture. Now, the opposite pole of that is what he calls the Christ of culture. Now, Christ of culture means that there's no conflict between Christ and the prevailing culture. Think of European, quote, Christendom, especially in the medieval period, where let's think of Spain in the 1500s, the 1400s, where Christ and the church were joined at the hip. And in fact, it would be very hard to distinguish between when you're going from church authorities to the king, like Ferdinand and Isabella, saw themselves as protectors of the faith. And so what did they do? They ran the Jews out, they ran the Muslims out, and they really conquered the New World on behalf of Christ. So, for instance, when the Spanish conquistadors came to the New World, they always had someone with them, right? A priest. So they were joined at the hip, right? That's the Christ of culture. So those are the two outside poles. And then in between those are kind of three variations on a theme. And the theme is that you have Christ above culture, not the Christ of culture, not the Christ against culture, but you might say Christ above culture. Christ is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and Christ rules over culture. Now, one version of that would be the notion of Christ and culture in synthesis. And this ends up being sort of the Thomas Aquinas medieval version of that. And here's what it means, is that you have a Holy Roman Emperor, and you have the Pope, and they are together sort of guarding Christianity, but they're always in conflict with each other. As you know, in Christendom of the medieval Europe, who was on first and who was on second was a very important issue. Was it going to be the Pope, quote, the spiritual ruler of Europe, or was it going to be the Holy Roman Empire, who had the temporal sword, that is an actual sword, and the Pope carried what? The spiritual sword. Now, Thomas Aquinas realized that there was going to be tension between these two, but basically what both were trying to do is safeguard Christian culture in Europe. So it's not exactly joined at the hip. There's a little bit more distance between church and state, because why? The Holy Roman Empire and the Pope were always at each other's throats, obviously. Now, you have Christ above culture, which moves towards a synthesis. And then the second one you have is a Lutheran position, which is sometimes described as Christ and culture in paradox. Now, let me explain what I mean by this. Luther felt that God's right hand was the church, and God's left hand was the state. And the state did things that the church should never do, and the church does things that the state should never do. There should be a kind of a paradoxical tension between them, but still they're on the same team. So Luther, like Aquinas, could never imagine separation of church and state. That thought never occurred to them. And let's remind ourselves, it's really an 18th century invention that you're going to separate church and state. So the synthesis of Aquinas, you have the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope sort of working together, but also tension. With Luther, the idea is they're a little bit farther apart. The state and the church are not exactly joined at the hip. There's a kind of a paradoxical tension. And then moving a little further along the spectrum is Calvin. Calvin also never imagined a total separation of church and state. But here's the difference between Calvin and Luther on this issue. Calvin believed that the state could be transformed by the power and sovereignty of God. That is, it can move closer to justice by working within the system. Let me give you an example of this. Luther really didn't go to city council meetings in Wittenberg. He would appeal to his local ruler, who basically gave him protection. But Calvin felt that it was incumbent upon him to go to the city council meetings of Geneva every week. And by the way, they got so tired of him at a certain point, they threw him out of town. And so Calvin is actually exiled from Geneva for a while, goes to Strasbourg, writes the Institutes of the Christian Religion, and then they invite him back. And the reason they threw him out of town is that they thought Calvin was pushing them too hard toward making Geneva a city on a hill, a kind of a Christian uh, example to the world of what the Protestant faith can do. Now, let me go back and explain what I'm trying to say here. There are 5 different options. The first 2 are real obvious. That is Christ against culture, and then Christ of culture, where they're just joined at the hip. The 3 in between, the Christ above culture, are varying forms of Christ impacting culture, but in kind of in different formats. I hope that makes sense to you. Now, if you're interested, go on the internet and click in H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture, and there are a number of nice overviews of that book. So, but can you get the idea? The 2 outsides are easy to understand. The 3 inside ones are kind of different. Now, let's take an example. When Luther dealt with the Peasants' Revolt, which was a group of radical Christians in the Reformed tradition who really wanted to make a sort of a communist society, a communal life where the Christian tradition would reign. And they really didn't want to bear allegiance to the German princes that were protecting Luther. Luther wrote one of his worst documents where he called on the Christian princes to obliterate the peasants. And in fact, that happened, and the peasants were destroyed. That, by the way, gave the Lutheran position a real black eye toward those who were on the bottom rung of the social economic ladder. Calvin, on the other hand, saw that the state should be a lot more circumspect in the way it uses its violence. And we could go into that more and more. But later Calvinists would take Calvin and say that the lower magistrates can and should revolt against tyrannical leaders. And that principle that lower magistrates can rebel against the higher magistrates is at the basis of the American Revolution. And it was the basis for the 17th century Cromwell revolt against the British crown that ended up Charles I losing his head to Cromwell and his pals. Okay. I hope everybody gets that. So now what I want to do is kind of give you a review of the course and say this. There is a way of looking at all these biblical writings that we've looked at and kind of put them more or less in these 5 categories. But here's a big thing I want to propose to you. When you're reading the Bible and you're looking at prophets and kings, here's the most important question. Were the prophets sort of inside the system, or were they completely on the margins and outside the system of power? Now, let me give you 2 quick examples to tell you what I'm talking about here. When you're talking about Joseph, who is the sort of the right-hand man to the Egyptian Pharaoh, you're talking about somebody within the system. If you're talking about Isaiah, you're talking about a prophet who has the king's ear. And whenever Isaiah speaks, the king of Judah has to pay attention. So Isaiah and Joseph, you might say, are inside the system. Now, if you want an example of someone who's outside the system, try this one: Elijah going against King Ahab. Now, that is really insider and outsider to the max. In fact, in the Elijah Ahab story, you remember the 400 priests of Baal who are supporting Ahab meet up with Elijah on Mount Carmel. And oh, what a fiery day that is. So that's an example of being outside the system and making a statement against the system. You might also say that John of Patmos is definitely outside the system. And in fact, he's in jail on the island of Patmos, and he is railing against the Roman Empire. In fact, calling it a beast, two beasts actually, and powered by the dragon. Now that's, you might say, being totally outside, literally and metaphorically. He is outside the system. He's on a prison island. And he is saying, look, the Roman Empire has become completely demonized. You get the picture here? So I would say that some of our prophetic voices were quite willing to see the state as a positive instrument that will do God's will. And so they sort of lean in favor of the state. Let me give you an example. Samuel is finally called to anoint Saul as king. And he does that, and then he becomes Saul's principal advisor. But he discovers that Saul is a very bad student, and he doesn't follow Samuel's advice. So then what happens? Samuel is told by the Lord, you're now going to anoint his successor, who is David. And David now becomes, as it were, the one who will be king. And it's Samuel who is the kingmaker twice over. First for Saul, then for Samuel. Talking about being an insider, he is actually a kingmaker. That is about being on the inside. Now, to continue the David story, let's remember this. It is Nathan, the prophet, who is an insider prophet, who finally confronts David and says, David, you have gone too far. You have killed Uriah, and you have taken his wife in an adulterous relationship, and she is pregnant, and this child will die. And so Nathan on the inside forces David to see his mistake and the consequences of that mistake. And by the way, David doesn't behead Nathan, because Nathan is the source of power, just as Samuel had been. So sometimes the prophetic voice is right inside at the table. And in fact, you might even say is at the head of the table, right? So you see that idea? Then you're going to have prophets that are definitely not at the table, and they are not welcome. Let me give you an example. Jeremiah. Jeremiah is called to a terrible task. He is called to tell the king of Judah, well, several of them, that they are going to be surrounded by the Babylonians, and the only thing that is the right thing to do, in fact, it's God's will that you do, is, are you ready for this? Surrender. Surrender. And the kings don't like that one little bit. So they throw him into a pit, remember? And if he hadn't been drug up by some friendly supporters, he would have died in that pit. And when he gets out of the pit, what does he do? I'm still telling you, surrender. These people are serious. And finally, when they don't surrender and Jerusalem is destroyed, Jeremiah is given a choice by the Babylonians. You want to go with us to Babylon, or do you want to stay here? And Jeremiah says, I'll stay here. And then eventually what happens? Some people revolt against the caretaker government, and they take him to Egypt. So the last word we get from Jeremiah is, I told you so, right? So Jeremiah is not welcome at the table. Jeremiah is, oh my. Well, let's go back to some other insiders. Now, again, I'm calling upon your memory, which as I get older becomes more problematic. But do you remember that Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8 become, in effect, advisors to Zerubbabel, who is the Persian appointed ruler to come down with the returning exiles. And what does Zechariah and what does Haggai do? They tell the Zerubbabel, you've got to finish this temple. You've got to keep building on this thing so that we'll have a place of worship. And they become insider advisors to Zerubbabel. Let's take another set of outsiders. These are real outsiders I'm going to talk about now, and they include people like Nahum and Obadiah. Now, they are outsiders in a double sense. Not only are they not part of the kingship of Israel or Judah, but they're now going to be speaking to a foreign kingship. Remember them? Obadiah says, look, you people in Edom, you allied yourself with the Babylonians, and when they were surrounding the city, you said to the Babylonians, in the words of Psalm 137, raise it down to the ground. And so Obadiah says, Edom will pay the price and they will be raised to the ground. By the way, lovely Psalm 137, that's where he says, how blessed are those who take your babies and smash their heads against the rocks. That's how angry they were about Edom taking part in the destruction of Jerusalem, when Edom was related, kissing kin, to Judah. Another one is Nahum. Nahum says, Assyria, you have been a violent empire. You have done things that no empire's ever done. And eventually you will pay the price for your violence. That's Nahum. And by the way, the answer to Nahum is another prophet who is really not a prophet. He's a cartoon, who is Jonah. Jonah is going to mimic an angry prophet like Nahum, who wants so bad to render judgment on Nineveh, but then he's called to do what? To give a message of repentance to Nineveh so that they would turn from their evil ways. And Jonah, who tries to escape, swallowed by a whale, spit up on shore, goes to Nineveh, still slime hanging off of him, angry that he has to do this. And he goes up there and preaches, and lo and behold, the whole city and even the cattle repent. They put on sackcloth and ashes on everybody. And Jonah is so angry, he could just spit. Well, God finally gets his attention, as you know. But my point is, there are some prophets who not only are outsiders to the Jewish power base, but they're outsiders to the country against whom they speak. By the way, as you recall, most of the Old Testament prophets have a section on the, quote, oracles against the nations, meaning that the best way to understand the oracles against the nations, truthfully, is to go back online and read the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Because what the prophets are saying is, you foreign nations have violated the human rights of all these people. And though you might have been called to do God's will, you overstepped your commission and became much, much, much too violent. In that same vein, do you remember 2nd Isaiah? 2nd Isaiah has the audacity to say that Cyrus the Persian is God's Mashiach in Hebrew, God's anointed, the one who is going to destroy the Babylonians and then end up freeing the Israelites to go back home out of bondage. Wow. 2nd Isaiah has the audacity to claim that Cyrus the Persian is God's own vehicle. Are you getting the picture here? Now, in the New Testament, what you have is uniformly prophets who are outside the power base. There's not a single prophet in the New Testament that is sort of an insider prophet. That role disappears in the New Testament. Why? Because you have a conquering foreign power, Rome, who has all the power in Jerusalem, and they have these puppet kings, the Herods, etc. And all the prophets of the New Testament are without power, and they're subject to persecution because of what they're going to say. And you recall our first and main example, John the Baptist. John the Baptist, who has some powerful things to say, not so much against the Romans, but against Herod Antipas, who's involved in an illicit marriage and does some very terrible things along the way. And John the Baptist confronts him and pays dearly for his opposition to the local ruler. He's sort of a puppet ruler. Then, when you get to Jesus, Jesus too has no political power. He is on the sort of the bottom of the social system in Israel. He is a mere laborer. He is, we call maybe a carpenter. He might have been a stone worker. The point is, he is at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And when Jesus starts criticizing Herod Antipas, Herod Antipas wants to kill him. And you remember the story? Jesus gets word from some Pharisees of all people that Herod Antipas is after him. So he leaves Galilee and he goes down into Israel, into Jerusalem. Now that's like leaving the fire into the frying pan, because now in Jerusalem, he's going to confront dual powers who are opposed to him. The Sanhedrin, which is the religious leadership, and now Rome itself. So Jesus has very little contact with Roman soldiers. You remember there's one in Luke 7 where he heals the slave of the centurion from Capernaum. And that's a really remarkable story. It's in all three synoptic gospels. So Jesus will go to Jerusalem, and there he will criticize the religious leadership. And then he'll be confronted with the biggest political issue of his time. Do you remember what that was? Taxes, money, follow the money. And the zealots had made a very decided choice. We are not going to pay taxes to a foreign government. That violates Deuteronomy 17 that says you'll have no foreign ruler over you. And then, of course, there are the collaborators, the Sanhedrin and the tax collectors and the Herods who say, oh, yeah, pay those taxes. And then there are the Pharisees who are, they're kind of waffling in the middle, maybe yes, maybe no. And then there's the Essenes, you recall, who are on the side of the zealots. Don't pay taxes. So Jesus confronts this with a question. Should we pay taxes? Now, he's already agreed what? He's going to pay taxes to the temple. The temple tax is already answered yes in Matthew 17. This is a different question. This is a tax to the Romans that does what? Supports those occupying troops and also builds some of those temples to Caesar as a divine figure. Oh, my gracious. But Jesus answers in a remarkable way that still has influence for us today. And he says, you give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and you give to God what belongs to God. So Jesus' answer is, you only give to Caesar money. That's it, money. Everything else you give to God. Well, that was a remarkable answer, and it's stood the test of time even to this day. A last prophet that we'll look at, Paul. Paul is an oddity because on the one hand, he has an insider status. Do you remember what that was? He has Roman citizenship, at least according to Acts. He never mentions it in the letters. He has Roman citizenship, and he can speak Greek, and he can speak Hebrew and Aramaic. Okay, he's bilingual, bicultural, and sort of citizens of two kingdoms, as it were, of Rome and of his Jewish patrimony. But he's also an outsider because he's not part of the regular Jewish hierarchy. He's not part of the Roman hierarchy of religion. He's starting a brand new religion called Christianity, based on Judaism, of course. So Paul has this paradoxical relationship. On the one hand, he's a Roman citizen. You remember he calls that trump card out several times when he's getting beat, etc. And when he's about to be killed in the temple, he calls that trump card out, saves his life. He appeals to Caesar, so he goes to Rome, etc. But on the other hand, he's subject to beatings and all kinds of injustice from the local governments. But he always calls on that trump card, Roman citizenship, to get out of jail. All right. So in Romans 13, he gives us a paradoxical picture of the government, right? On the one hand, it's instituted of God. It basically is there to suppress disorder. And so what do? You pay them their taxes, right? But on the other hand, you don't give to the government what does not belong to them: your soul, your allegiance, your life. And remember, there was no concept of what in the first century? Democracy, representative democracy, freedoms, those sort of things. That just didn't exist. So it didn't apply. All right. So let's step back for just a second. So the main question about prophets and kings in the entire biblical narrative is what? Are you an insider that has a place at the table to speak to those in power? Or are you an outsider and you really don't have a place at the table? Now, again, some prophets end up sort of having both. Paul, with his Roman citizenship, has sort of a dual aspect like that. Isaiah is a perfect example in the Old Testament, who's both an insider and speaks from the outside. So where does that leave us? As Christians, that means we have to sort of be more precise about where we are on that continuum of being an insider and being an outsider. And here's what I would suggest to you, that in our North American context, we're sort of somewhere in between. I would say, of the prophets that we have studied, the closest to our position might be Paul. Paul, in the sense that he is a Roman citizen, and yet he's really not in the tables. He doesn't sit in the power with the powerful, but he has that Roman citizenship, etc. And in fact, he shames the Roman authorities in Philippi, remember, who had beat him and put him in jail. And they wanted to quietly dismiss him and make sure he leaves town. And what does he do? Oh, no, they're going to have to come here and they're going to have to apologize to me. Remember that one? That's called using the trump card. Now, so we're sort of in the middle. Some of us in the Christian church have gained positions of great authority and power, right? I've been reading some stuff lately about Joe Biden and his own understanding of himself as a Roman Catholic, practicing Roman Catholic Christian. Joe Biden now is at the ultimate seat of power, right? And he faces the same questions about his religion as John F. Kennedy did back in the early 60s. And Kennedy, you recall, goes to Houston and gives a speech to all the ministers there. I'm not going to take my directions, from Rome. If there's a real conflict between my religion and my duty to country, I'll resign, is what he said in that. Joe Biden now is going to be a Christian at the zenith of power in the world. And it'll be interesting to see how he negotiates that sort of tension within himself, no doubt. All right. So for us as Christians, I think we try to locate ourselves on that spectrum of being in the seat of power and totally outside. Now, if you're a Christian in some places that I visited, for instance, China and Cuba, you don't have much of a shot at being in a position of power. You're much further away from that, somewhat like John of Patmos. You're a long ways from power. And I think I told you that I sat with some Christian pastors who had been thrown in jail by both the Chinese government and by the Cuban government. And that's a different world that we live in the United States. So let's suppose that our relationship is closest to, say, Paul. Well, Paul plus, because we have not only citizenship, but we have the right to be involved in a representative government with decisions much greater than just the question of taxes, all kinds of policies. So it becomes incumbent upon us, I think, to be responsible participants in a representative democracy. And here, I think our model is who? Calvin, who goes to the city council meeting every week. You know, sometimes it's so overbearing to throw him out of town. But the point is, John Calvin has citizenship in Geneva. He goes to the city council. He's never a member of the city council, by the way, and he voices his opinion. And then some of us might even be in positions of authority. All right. So that's kind of what we might glean from reading Christ in Culture and overlaying it to this study of prophets and kings within the biblical tradition. And I would say the answer to the question, what is a Christian's relationship to government? I would say, without trying to be cute, the answer is it depends. It depends upon where we are in the spectrum and what kind of access we have and what kind of responsibility we have. So I would say a final word here. The one responsibility that First Timothy and First Peter say that the Christian has to the government is, even before taxes, is to pray for the emperor. Now remember, who are they talking about? They're talking about characters like Caligula, Nero, Domitian, Mad Dogs, every one of them. Pray for the emperor. So I would say to us, in our liturgical life, we should always pray for those in authority. Pray for their wisdom. Pray that they might render things just and fairly in the world. And remember, the number one criterion for the king is to, well, first of all, honor God, and secondly, care for the poor. Those are the two poles of a king's responsibility in Deuteronomy. Honor God, care for the poor. Okay. So those are some thoughts. And I would really be interested in your thoughts now.